Bonjour à toutes.
Good morning. Good morning. We're opening the session called Setting 2030 as the Climate Horizon. To introduce the session briefly, as you know, this was said several times in various sessions beforehand in X. The last ICPC report draws the alarm. You know, it says we don't do enough, we don't do it fast enough, and the global warming is speeding up. Well, the views of the economists that, well, the reason is simple. Climate is, in fact, a global public good, and to preserve the means that we would have cooperative and coordinated policies. It's a global common good, but we should define a horizon, an objective of efforts, and to share it among all the participants. Being said like that is rather simple, but the effort, you know it. Well, that is decarbonation. Participants, you know them as well, are the 200 countries sitting around the table, and it is with them that we need to agree. So we found a method. We thought we had found a method called the Paris Agreement, which claimed the global joint common objective, but the Paris Agreement did not implement the two elements mentioned as an absolute necessity, that is coordination and cooperation. No coordination, because if you take the total sum of all the commitment made by the various nations, you'd certainly not achieve the reduction of emission that would ensure the well, not too catastrophic climate transition, even if the commitments were complied with, and lack of cooperation, because we did not find a way to be certain that countries would walk the talk and do what they said they would do. So the question of 2030 is not just a date mentioned by the Europeans, in good French, what they call the Fit for 55 package. This decarbonation horizon for the European industry, less than 55% emission versus 1990. You know, it was said that minus 50%. I mean, minus 50, 55 versus 1990. So it's not as strong as less than 55% versus today. So don't panic. But this 2030 horizon is the result of 15 years of success of the Paris Agreement, and it's the start of a time watch, because in 2030 there will be 2 decades left to reach the carbon neutrality, and the minus 55 horizon is feasible, but from 2030 to 2050, it's going to be more difficult, because the slope is steeper, and we will have to remove the last emission-producing systems, and that won't be a marginal cost. Is civil society, are the economic players here, will they be capable to achieve this energy transition that probably policies alone will not make it possible to achieve? So to deal with, we have a video capsule. We are modern people in X, and this video capsule, a little shot with Inger Anderson from the PNUD will, the UNDP, sorry, will say that. Then we'll have Alain Terneuf, the Institute for New Economic Thinking, and I think we do need that, who will talk about, will give us a video, will talk with us on video, but around the table, physically, Jacques Le Pape, who is the president of the Reassurance Central Office, Olivier Jabert, who is a senior partner in the Boston Consulting Group, Claire Desan, who is not listening to me and who is chatting with who is the Secretary General of NG, and finally the other one who was not listening either, Stan Giegold, who is Chairman State Secretary to the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Action, and who will take the floor in English. So this has been said. I leave the floor to the video. Thank you.
Thank you.
Climate action is crucial for tackling the interconnected triple planetary crisis, the crisis of climate change, the crisis of nature and biodiversity loss, and of course the crisis of pollution and waste. But the hard truth is that the international community is not getting a passing grade on the Paris Agreement. To keep 1.5 degrees alive, we need to almost halve emissions by 2030. And bear in mind that we set this almost a year ago. We are halfway through 2022, and frankly, we have seen virtually no progress on the Glasgow Climate Pact. No major emitters have updated their national determined contributions or NDCs. No countries have joined the coal exit. Progress on committing to electric vehicles, for example, is sluggish. We're still looking at a global temperature rise ranging from just over 2.1 degrees to close to 3 degrees Celsius, depending, of course, on the mix of net zero commitments and conditional NDCs that we implement. Anywhere in this range would, frankly, be a total catastrophe for reasons we all well understand. Now, I know that all eyes are on Ukraine, and rightly so, and the associated energy and food and finance crisis caused by the conflict. But we cannot let setbacks in one country set the pathway globally. The no regression principle means that once a treaty is signed, we can't go back. It's time to use regulatory levers to accelerate green investment, not scramble to replace sources of oil and gas. In short, we know how to meet our climate commitments, and now, frankly, we need to do it. We must transform the energy and transport system. We must exit coal, back renewables and energy efficiency, and move to sustainable transport. We must transform food systems, make agriculture low carbon, resource efficient, and nature positive, and of course, cut food waste and loss. We must back nature in decision-making because nature-based solutions can provide a large proportion of the mitigation effort out to 2030. And this, by the way, includes bringing nature into our cities to cool them, to help cities adapt to climate change, and to make cities more livable. And we must back circularity and sustainable consumption and production. And here let me say that the international deal on plastic pollution under negotiations could make a big difference to climate change and set a clear model for the circular economy. And we must boost adaptation support to help developing countries deal with climate impacts that are already locked in. And of course, we must deliver on our promise and the climate finance that we promised back in 2009 and re-promised at COP21 in 2015. It's time to have that 100 billion every year on the table. And then we must redesign the entire financial system in support of all these transformations. Look, I'm not saying that we made no progress at all. Under the Science Based Targets Initiative, over 340 companies have committed to setting net zero targets across their operations and value chains. And the UNEP Finance Initiative convenes 3 finance sectors, net zero alliances, and is mobilizing financial institutions to transition their holdings and their portfolios into alignment with the 1.5 degree, a move that makes complete sense for those who do not wish to end up holding significant stranded assets. And around 400 cities have committed to net zero emissions by 2050. 92 companies have joined EV 100, a worldwide initiative seeking to accelerate the transition to electric vehicle by 2030. In many places around the world, it's already cheaper to get electricity from solar than from fossil fuels. But you'll notice here that I'm saying committed. These are promises. I'm saying seeking to. These are also promises. But what we really need now is more implementation. This year must be the year that kicks off the action era, including at the upcoming COP27 in Egypt. We have the knowledge and means to address climate change. We have the commitments. We have the momentum for change in the growing popular support and youth movements. With reinvigorated multilateralism and the knowledge that we must treat the triple planetary crisis as a single challenge, we can get the job done, but only if we begin to act on the commitments made, and act now.
all clear. We need to act now, and we had a long to-do list. With no further ado, I will now give the floor to Adair Tona. And now put the question to you, and I can guess the answer, because we talked about that before, in what was said. There was the two words, stranded assets, the stranded assets. It is that a certain number of equipment, capitals, or field, gas field or oil field will have to be abandoned. This is lost capital. As an economist, I thought that there was a risk, a financial risk, major financial risk, at least a question. But I know that Mr. Turner has certain diverging views. So this is the question I'm putting to you. Don't we do too much about this of the stranded assets, Mr. Turner?
In Aix, I hope you can hear me. I think when we think about the investment issue of getting to net zero, there is a stranded asset issue, but it's not the most important. In order to build a zero carbon economy by 2050, the world has to invest probably about a gross level of $4 trillion per annum on average over the next 30 years. And we actually know where the vast majority of that investment need is. About 3/4 of it, and that is our figures from the Energy Transition Commission that I chair, but it is also the figures of the International Energy Agency and everybody else that has looked at it. About 3/4 of the $4 trillion per annum is building a bigger, new, zero carbon electricity system, primarily from renewables, but there will also be roles for nuclear and hydro as well. More generation, more transmission, more distribution. I think we have to realize that even in rich developed countries, the only way to get to a zero carbon economy is for us to consume and use and produce about twice as much electricity as at the moment. In India, it's 5 or 6 times. In Africa, it's 10 or 15 times. And the most important issue in finance is, where is the finance going to come from to build that new electricity system? And that underpins everything else. For instance, we know now how to produce zero carbon steel using hydrogen as the reduction agent rather than coking coal. But when you look at the investments required to build a global zero carbon steel system, and we are about to produce a report on this, about 80% of them don't reside in the steel company assets themselves. They reside in the green hydrogen production for those steel companies, but indeed the renewable energy which drives the green hydrogen production. So let's be clear, our biggest issue is not stranded assets, it is the new assets that we need on a massive scale in order to achieve a zero carbon economy. It is also true, however, that there are things that we've got to stop doing. We at present invest about 800 billion a year in the fossil fuel system. And that includes investments still sadly in coal mines, still sadly in coal plants and in new oil and gas fields. It's absolutely clear on the coal side that we have got to stop investing in new coal immediately, and as the Glasgow COP26 conference agreed, to begin the phase down of existing coal. That will create, as we phase down existing coal, some assets which will have to be written off. And there is a big issue about how the rich developed world provides funds to compensate some lower income developing countries for the closure of coal plants, coal power plants, before end of useful life. But the bigger issue, and I think the issue on which insurance companies, asset managers, banks are now struggling, is what should their attitude be to new oil and gas development. The International Energy Agency, led by Fatih Birol, has clearly said that if we are serious about 1.5 degrees centigrade, there should be no new investment at all in new oil and gas developments. But of course, in the aftermath of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there are many people saying that we should now develop new gas assets. Our strong belief at the Energy Transition Commission is that we need to be very cautious of that, and that broadly speaking, the IEA is right, that we should now be in an environment where we develop no new oil and gas. There will continue to be some investment to maintain production from existing fields for a time. But to give you an idea of what is required, if we are to get to net zero by 2050, we will have to reduce the use of oil by about 80 or 90% by then, down to, say, 15 million barrels of oil a day. And we will need to reduce gas use by 40%. So we will only do that if we now start cutting out the new investment in oil and gas quite dramatically. Because if we don't, that will create either a stranded asset or an asset which, if it isn't stranded, if it goes on being used, will make it completely impossible to meet our climate targets. But I return to my first point. Yes, there is an issue on stranded assets. Yes, there is an issue about ceasing that investment in new oil and gas. But the even more important issue is that we will not get to a zero carbon economy where we need to be by 2050 and where we need to be by 2030 unless we accelerate quite dramatically the pace at which we build a zero carbon electricity system. And that is where the big number of investment is required.
Merci beaucoup, c'est absolument...
Thank you very much. Clear?
La priorité est ce qui va coûter très cher, vous avez donné.
Priority will be very expensive. What will be to build those new electrical systems that will make it possible to have a better electrification of all the systems, and this is highly complicated, well, in advanced countries as well as in developing countries. So, before doing this and to see how we could do this, well, there was a call early on to the insurance companies and the bankers not to finance new oil and gas fields, or if we want to get to net zero in 2050. But insurance companies, I think, have another topic, that global change anyway has an impact on their activities. And Jacques Le Pape will be able to explain to us how is this perceived on the insurance side. Thank you. Hello. What I have from the first speaker, that we have to move to action. If we remember the hair and the torches, you know, to discussion is good, but the acting is better. Of course, we are more downstream in the system, because we are as the public reassurance company that will help French insurance companies to indemnify compensate French families when they are victims of natural disasters. So this is the result of climate change, of course, because now for several decades we can see that there are more and more natural disasters and more people to be compensated for or to be reimbursed. So what we do is we help insurance companies to back them up when there is a major disaster, natural disaster, set the cost, pay the cost, for example, floods or drought on the other side. You know, about these cracks you see in houses, for example. This is what you see because of the drought, when there is a shrinking and expansion of clay, or because of due to the fact that the drought is fiercer some years, and floods and hyperhydration of the ground is unforeseeable. So this is the basic work of the reinsurance company and our group, and we get downstream, where we look at the consequences of what was mentioned early on. So the decision, actually, in all those main issues is essential for people, and we are bearing witness, and we are witness of that. And thanks to the 20 euros provided by each French families through their damage insurance premium, well, we can indemnify 1.3 billion per year due to catastrophes or disasters. So it's a concrete issue. And what we see as well is that because of the trends mentioned and because of the fact we are more in the discussion than in the action as such of the main topics we will discuss later on, nuclear, not nuclear, climate change is one thing, but we see the consequences and the impacts, and together with Météo France, the French weather forecast system, our company has designed a model which makes it possible to look at the, what can wait and what cannot wait, and the impact for French households of the risk of that we reinsure. Well, there's an inflation in addition to the monetary inflation of 1.5%. And this, that what can be anticipated between now and 2050. So basically, today it costs you 1.3 billion per year, and all things being equal, in constant euro, we know this will cost at least 2 billion. So question is, and this is where we look back with the general issue problematics, how do we prevent that? Well, several methods do exist. The unpleasant one, you increase the premium. Another one, which is painful, to reduce the payment when there is a problem. But there is another one, which is more interesting and which corresponds to the choices to be made. It's prevention. And I would like to be concrete. Prevention is like the three little piglets. I mean, did you build your house in straw or in bricks and cement? Because, of course, when you build dikes or banks to make sure that the last floods in the city where you're the mayor, if you have dikes or embankments, well, the next flood there will be less impact, so it will be better for everybody. So it might be more concrete than the major energy choices, more short-term vision, but it's doable. And we do believe that in order to finance or to avoid the overcost of 2 billion euros that we foresee between now and 2050, prevention is one of the good methods. There is a governmental fund where we have a key role to play, 100 million per year, which makes it possible to finance works and structures. And we believe that 100 million per year will be able to save in the long term more than 100 million per year in the overcost of natural disaster to be feared. Back to the three piglets, the Mélan law provides us with a new basis for construction of new houses in France, which should make it possible when it comes to new buildings to minimize the impact of cracks in the houses, of drought, which anyway is here, and which is stronger and harder than it was in the past. So our contribution to the discussion is, anyway, someone will pay. Let's try to take precaution to avoid the nasty bill, So let's act quickly and make decision rapidly. Thank you very much. Adaptation, and now. So now we talked about the households. They're not the only one concerned, but let's talk about the businesses now. And I will ask Frédéric Jobert, within this environment, what are the good strategies from the firms to be, I don't like the word, but it summarizes, to be resilient, even though I don't like that word, in this new environment. Thank you. Good morning. Well, I think you, Inger, and yourself, Jacques, you said it. 2030 horizon is 8 years, minus 50% in 8 years. It's spectacular. So therefore, we cannot minimize, just bet on the future, but we have to be in action, move into action, and to plan the action, to implement them, to assess the impact month per month, year per year, and possibly correct trajectories. This is the problem of ecological and energy planification. And at the level of businesses, the transformation plans, which are being implemented like any business plan in the past. In the past they had growth plan. Now we have climate transformation plans. The method is the same, basically, to be acting. Now, when following your question, two convictions concerning business strategies, and I'm sure it will echo in What and how? What? Well, that is the content of the business strategies, the climate-linked transformation. Two ways to look at it. First is to decarbonate whatever exists, to consider, to model and a supply chain, a production line, and systematically implement all the technologies, techniques known to remove carbon from that, renewable energies, nuclear power plant, electrical powers, hydrogen, carbon capture, biomass, artificial intelligence will stop.
Bien sûr qu'il faut le faire, encore une fois.
Of course, this needs to be done. We have to act. But what is interesting is that the 2030 horizon, unfortunately, is not consistent with the time frame for that approach. It's not fast enough. So we can dispute it. Some sectors are moving on faster than others. But one of the key points of that transformation is to reach 100% of renewable or renewably sourced or nuclear sourced electricity. So, as you said, we have to actually convert some of our usages to electric. So you can measure the gap between 34% and 100 because we are currently at 34%. But 10 years ago, the share of renewable energy, renewable plus nuclear, was 32% 10 years ago. It's gone up by 2% over the last 10 years. And at the end of the day, we only have one planet, and global warming is very much accelerating. So you see that we have our work cut out. And 30 years ago, that share of renewable and nuclear energy was 36%. So we've actually moved backward. So this is definitely not changing fast enough. It imposes on us to rethink a number of things and to imagine new ways of practicing capitalism, thinking up new business models, thinking up new ways of generating value for our customers. And this is not esoteric. It is bioeconomics. It's the business model of reusing rather than buying systematically. For private companies to really rise to the challenge, decarbonizing what's already existing is not enough. That's the first point I wanted to make. For companies to be able to engineer these transformations, they need to be able to fund it, and Mr. Turner mentioned it. Costs and revenues have to be consistent because these companies need to be viable, and that's the whole point of the regulatory framework standards. I think we'll come back to that. It's also everything to do with carbon tax, subsidies, so we can lament that it's not moving on fast enough. But our second belief, if you will, is that there are men and women who accept to take on these new jobs or the jobs from the past, industrial jobs, labor, manual labor that we've forgotten a bit about. And we need customers. We need demand for these new business models, these new ways of creating value. So we need people who accept circular economy and to put as much value on a second-hand product than for a brand new product, who fully buy into sustainable development and a sustainable economy. So we need to really operate a paradigm shift, a cultural shift, and create a new culture. And maybe to use a simile, it is like a prisoner that is on a lifelong sentence, I'm not going to buy this product because I don't have the purchasing power for that. I'm not going to invest in that new plant, because it's going to cost too much money. So actually, we all are reluctant to make the necessary effort. And we need actually to put in more effort, all and every one of us. So we need to do more, and the right way to do this is to do things differently, not replacing home delivery of pizzas by motorbike, by electric scooters. That's not enough. Claire, you are at the helm, representing ENGIE here to tell us about paradigm shifts in the energy sector. So when we talk about 2030, there's what can be done right now in the short term and what can be done in the medium and long term. New ways of producing and using gas so that we might move on to a fully electrified economy, as Mr. Turner mentioned and wished for. Well, I won't talk about gas only, but a comment. I'm quite happy to add a bit of gender equality in this panel because, you know, this transition that we want that we advocate for will be made possible by men and women. Well, we need a business model that is fully adapted and fully in line with energy transition. It's been said before, but it needs to be reasserted. It is the condition for sustainability and capacity to and thus to create jobs and growth and in the long term. It's really a long haul effort. So we shouldn't only talk the talk, but also walk the walk. And to that end, we need to be clear on our goals. What do we mean by that? For an energy company such as ENGIE, we need to really set our objectives and then steer the course, stay the course. So decarbonization by 2045 and a trajectory for all of our activities that is consistent with a temperature rise of less than 2 degrees. And this is what's imperative on us to do. There are milestones in 2025, 2030, and 2025 is really around the corner. So this is about the decisions we're going to make day in, day out. So firstly, we need to be very clear on our objectives. Secondly, we need processes that guarantee that we can actually achieve it. And from that perspective, at ENGIE, we've really moved on to a steering of our carbon performance that is identical to the way we steer our financial performance. So for each and every activity, we have carbon budgets that are allocated to each business line, including for their investments. And then we have reviews on a quarterly basis. Where are we at? Taking stock in terms of our financial trajectory, but also our carbon trajectory. Of course, it's a must. So objectives and steering that has to be really a fine steering. So how do we make it happen? Well, we need to make clear choices. First choice, ENGIE exited everything to do with exploration and production of gas. That was years ago. We are currently exiting coal. It now represents less than 4% of our power production. It will be zero by 2027. So we will have completely decommissioned all our coal-powered plants. Alongside this, we try to intensify, really enhance the development of all renewables and also renewable electricity, because what is energy transition? If we take a step back, it's a drop in consumption by 40% and the development of a green energy for electricity and gas. We are the leading developer of wind power and solar power in France, and we want to multiply twofold our installed capacity from 3 gigawatts to 6 gigawatts. And we also want to develop green gas. Why? Because all economic models go to show it, and all the scenarios demonstrate that gas can play a role in energy transformation, because there will be a diversification of usages. We talked about cars, but alongside that, there are a number of usages that are difficult to move to electricity. Steel production, for example, there's a number of industries for which it is a lot easier and less costly. The ton of carbon is a lot easier to eradicate if we use renewable gas rather than electric technologies. It's true for heavy industry, and it's true for a number of heavy mobility. So gas will be useful, but they need to become greener, biomethane and green hydrogen. I'll speed up a bit because I don't want to speak too long. To exit carbon, intensify electric and renewable electric, and we have the capacity to completely do without Russian sourcing of gas by 2030. And I'd like to add on a positive note, that call for action, sometimes it doesn't translate into actions at state levels because there's a number of diverging interests. So from COP to COP, there are always weak links. But if you look at companies, at local governments, local communities, there's a strong demand. And we are in capacity to really speed things up. So this can be done, and that's the contribution we can make. Deploying our renewable energy, electricity, gas, exit coal, and come up with solutions for decarbonization to others. Thank you. Well, you can see why it's so important to have women sitting on these panels, because between Ms. Anderson and Ms. Waysand, they strike a positive note and help us see the path towards a more sustainable society. Sven Giegold, the interest for the point of having a German Secretary of State on this panel is to reflect on discrepancies between our countries. So talking about energy mix, how we can get organized to achieve our goals. So France, of course, has put a lot of eggs in the nuclear basket. In Germany, you've always had a much lower share of nuclear energy. And some people say that Germans actually bore the brunt of the cost of the development of renewables in Europe. How do you see the right way to meet our objectives? So decarbonization by 2050. So we'll be delighted to hear your viewpoint. And this is not a veiled criticism. We need you to explain how it's going to work. All right, I'll try and speak French. I guess it'll be easier to chat with my fellow panelists. I'm not sure, actually. If we are a bit provocative and crack a joke, really, both countries, France and Germany, are actually phasing out nuclear. If I look at the figures on both sides, there is energy friendship between our two countries. And thanks to the difficulties of some nuclear plants over here in France, our will to phase out nuclear is made even stronger in Germany. But all jokes aside, I'm a fairly conservative person, you know. I live in a small village north of Germany. It's usually cold out there. There's not much sun. But having said that, if I see on my smartphone, you know, as a family, I have a picture of my family, but I can always see the figures of renewable energy. We've invested in renewables, and it represents tenfold our consumption. Our region is not very rich. It's sort of average. But our region is still going to become a big producer of renewable energy. More and more neighbors use their roofs to become energy producers. And this is what my family has done. It's the prosumer movement. And you see the same trend in Poland. It's really interesting to see that in the most conservative regions, there's a lot of investment in renewables by private citizens. And so this conditions the success of energy transition for the more disadvantaged areas. Energy transition cannot work if it's only about costs. There has to be an economic, industrial, and social strategy backing it up. Energy transition is something that, if it's only seen as something that's going to prove to be very costly, then it's never going to work in the end. We have to have business models that are profitable to make it efficient and unlock the forces of capitalism to help us completely phase out fossil fuels. And this is what is at the heart of the strategy of the German government. We passed a bill in record times, the Easter package, and that package is going to really unlock a wave of investment in renewables and towards more energy efficiency. And thanks to that package, we will become renewable energy producers up to 80% renewable by 2030. And we're going to electrify heat systems in buildings and in a big chunk of the industry and automotive industry. Our objective is to have 46 million of electric vehicles based on renewably sourced electricity by 2030. And these EVs will also be the instrument for safeguarding whenever wind power or solar energies is a bit too intermittent and not reliable. There have to be gains in competitiveness, and even in Germany, when it's cold, renewables cost less than non-renewable energies, which is why we don't stand to lose any money with nuclear, because we're going to invest, because that would be a waste of money from our viewpoint to invest in nuclear. We are going to invest in new renewables in a country that is not very big, that is rather cold in terms of weather and densely populated. It is our clear will to invest in renewables, and we're on the same page with our industries and our leading companies, and the society is also behind us. We have a clear will to really push for that all together. Thank you very much. Well, as you know, in X, we are fortunate enough to have economic journalists who follow up on all the debates. So I think tomorrow what's going to make the headlines will be the speech by Bruno Le Maire. But I think on that same headlines, it will be featured that France is going to exit, to phase out nuclear. That for sure should be on the first page. I'll give you the floor for 5 minutes each before we wrap up. There's a question that I have on my iPad, which ties in nicely with questions put in other sessions. You didn't talk about the carbon price. Do you think it is the absolute condition to make everything possible? Who'd like to go first? Claire, maybe? It's a very good question. We mentioned it implicitly because we said that regulatory framework that regulatory framework is absolutely essential for energy transition to be possible. So the price of carbon is absolutely essential. What do we mean by that? When you emit greenhouse gas emissions, you have to pay to compensate for these emissions. So it's the polluter pays principle. And this is a mechanism that is extremely powerful, potentially, to encourage companies and the whole society to decarbonize and to encourage them to decarbonize their production tools. As an energy company, we are fully convinced that the price of carbon is a main driver to move towards that decarbonized economy. Having said that, there are social aspects and issues of redistribution that are absolutely essential and that should be tackled. We haven't mentioned that, but the acceptance, the buy-in of that energy transition is absolutely essential so that all the local communities can buy into that strategy, because energy, of course, and fuel prices are at the heart of the household budget. Well, price of carbon, regulation, what do you advocate for? Well, this clearly resonates. Let me talk about our daily behavior. Just walk outside the park and walk in the street. And walking down the street, you'll see people who drive alone, that hotel rooms have air conditioning during the day, even though they're empty. So I might sound a bit provocative, but our day-to-day behavior does not really factor in the energy crisis we are in the throes of. We seem to think that energy still comes at a very low price, so we need a price of carbon to put that behind us. Well, that's very clear. Jacques. Well, I can only repeat and reiterate what I said before. Price of carbon is a major incentive, and because at the end of the day, there's a bill that needs to be footed. So you need to anticipate, and people should get organized, and they're free to do what they want to do. But if they want to spend money to finance the energy transition, well, and fight climate change, why not? I find it a bit funny, to be honest, because next week and last week, we've already voted as Council of the European Union with emission trading scheme, rising the price of carbon. So we reached a consensus within the Council of the European Union, and revenue, proceeds from this should be invested to help households transition, especially households that are from more disadvantaged backgrounds. Because if we don't do that, there'll be a social backlash, as we've seen with the Yellow Vest movement in France. So we have to learn the lesson from that. We have to compensate and decompensate at the same time. Right, with that wrapping up, I was asked to make an announcement. It will seem funny to you, but since we're talking about redistribution, globalization, I've been asked to announce that Lionel Fontanier will be signing his excellent book about the impact of globalization on labor markets, on your pay slip, and on your purchasing power. That wonderful book that is entitled Pay Slips and Shopping Trolleys. If you want to buy it, go to the bookshop booth that is further down in the park. Thank you very much to all speakers. I think this was great, very interesting conversation, and this announcement that will be on the front page of our daily newspapers. France is to phase out nuclear.
Bonjour à tous.
Good morning, sorry, good morning. So in this session, we want to try some answers to a question which is of interest to all of us for the last 2 years, ever since we heard the word COVID-19 for the first time. How could we prevent any new sanitary impact or shocks? There will be participants who will give us different views on this question, be it prevention, logistics, and of course, political side as well. So we have with us Pierre-Yves Joffard, member of the Cercle des Économistes, an expert in the health economy, Xiao Xiaolong, who is a poet and a novelist specialized in thrillers, Sylvie Briand, who is Director for Preparation and Epidemics Prevention in the World Health Organization, Salida Badma Asaid, who is the founder of a mental health clinic in the Sultanate of Oman, with pause of sanitary and the World Sanitary, and Philippe Lamoureux, who is the Director General of LEM, the drug industry, which is basically the union of drug industries in Europe, in France. Pierre-Yves, you have the floor. Thank you all, you all for being with us today. It is indeed, well, we are, for the last 2 years now, we've been in a pandemic that was not anticipated. So there are many countries that have been surprised, especially in France and in Europe. So other countries were better prepared, possibly because they had experienced pandemics more recently, and they were able to implement structures which could be active and rapidly active in the case of new pandemics. And in Europe, we were in this direct configuration. Is it? Can you hear me, sir? This is what we had very radical measures and confinement, which in the first confinement, let's remember that in economic and social terms what it meant, that is, for the first confinement, there was a drop of activities of 30%. So 30% of the GDP drop. So if it had lasted all year round, we would have been 30% of GDP over the year. So it's huge, which means less resources to be consumed, shared among all the others. Can you hear me, sir? And can you hear the translation? Yes? Okay, so it was such a drop of the GDP, of course, raises challenges, major problems when many people can be devoid of revenues, so deprived of revenues. So in many countries, the lockdown, social restriction, economic restriction caused, drops in revenues. In France, there were many stabilization mechanisms activated, with a considerable increase of social transfers. In 2021, the state spent 380 billion euros with a high increase of social transfer expenditures, and the revenues dropped. So the 250 billion, we talk about deficit when it comes to GDP percentage, but last year, the revenues of the state were 250 billion, and the revenues and the expenditures 380 billion. So we had to do it because we spent more money than we actually earned. So those are elements of context. We state it will not be possible to do that 5 times in the next 5-10 years. So we have to get ready to brace ourselves for something different. So how can we avoid ending up in situations which could lead us to make such decisions, which are economically costly, of course, but which, in terms of health care, they're very costly as well, because hospitals and especially emergency units were, were somewhat clogged. And the last figures for France, we consider that since the beginning of the epidemic, 150,000 deaths caused by the COVID. So it's not something, it's not a minor, 600,000 deaths per year and 150,000 more caused by COVID. So if we could prevent that, it would help. So we should be able to avoid this cost for the health of the population and the cost for the economic and social activity. So let's look at the questions we'll cover the horizon. We'll talk about what happened in China, and what happened in China, and what could actually happen in the future. What happened in China was not just a health crisis, there were the social responses that fit within society which is undergoing deep changes and transformations, with stakes which are associated with the, are linked to the social stakes, but it's the changes. But, well, I think only partly, but the pandemic came from China, so we can see how this major society organize its answer and implement systems or devices to do mass monitoring. This could help us ponder what could happen in the future and possibly how could we prevent it. Then Sylvie Briand will talk about will give us the World Health Organization views of viewpoint. This pandemic is in a specific moment of technological evolution, quite a strong one, and the answers we can provide from in a country or one another fit within an international context that must be taken into account with coordination problematics for the various actions. Next, Saïda by Ismail Said, who will take the floor remotely, will talk about the sanitary stakes or challenges in another domain, which is sometimes mentioned and certainly must be taken into account, the impact on mental health. Pandemics, not just the pandemics, but the social response, the organizations to react to the pandemics do have an impact on the mental health of the population. Someone is stopping me, assigning me the stop signal. I'm only at 4 minutes. Initially it was 7 minutes. Well, I'll stop then. I'll stop now, all right. And simply by conclude on Philippe Lamour, who will conclude the first round of discussion back to the issue of the question of innovation, pharmaceutical innovation, which was fascinating to follow during the pandemics. It was a new virus, and rapidly we got the vaccines. This is to be reminded, quite a performance. Was it available to all? That's another problem, but we'll look into that. And how can we get ready now? How can we be ready? How can we brace for the next pandemics? And coming back to France, France produced no vaccine, by the way, unlike many other great countries. How can we come back to France? So, with no further ado, I give the floor to the moderation. Give the moderation to Sarah. I will give the floor now to Xiao. Maybe we'll start with you, sir. Can you tell us your last novel and your views on the situation of this crisis? Thank you. Remove your headphones, sir.
Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I'm actually been working on a new novel, which should be coming out at the end of this year, the French version. It's titled Love and Murder in the COVID Days. Of course, it's about China. It's about China. Ironically, I've been to Wuhan just a couple months before the outbreak of coronavirus. And I was born in Shanghai, so what happened to Shanghai this year really, changed my thinking about the disaster. What worried me is with the Omicron, for most people, of course, it's still serious, but for most people, it's like a flu, right? So the Chinese government should have come up with a different response. But no, they even push the zero out, Qingling, or lockdown further with advanced technology and turning China into a civilization society like George Orwell's 1984. And that's what really worries me. Let me give you a few examples because I can only speak from a writer's perspective. In Wuhan, a young doctor worked in a hospital. He just sent a WeChat message about something serious is spreading in the hospital. You better take better care of yourself. So he did not say anything else. But even for the website, there are numerous people called net cops. Anything, any post you placed will be immediately discovered. And he was, Dr. Li, a real person, he was summoned into the police bureau and had to sign a guilty plea and a promise, or I lied or something. So it's such a huge blow. And ironically, he fell sick with the virus himself and died shortly afterwards. The whole nation mourned him. I wrote a poem for him too. And this is, how severe the surveillance and control situation can be in China. And this certainly led to the more people get infected, right? You cover up until you cannot, and then it's too late. So Wuhan is locked down. Now, about in Shanghai, I would say things even more scary to me, at least to me. Again, I can give you some example I'm writing into my book. And it's a real example, but in my book it will be fictionalized. But Shanghai now pushed forward a COVID code. It's like they can automatically check whether they have done a test, what's the result of a test, and if you're okay, it's a green code. If not, red code. And in some cases, likely, it's a yellow code. For instance, if I come close to someone, say 10 feet, okay, if someone has a red code, then my code will also be changed. I don't know how they can do that. So it will be either red or yellow. I will also be sent to the quarantine camp. But the government calls that the companionship of the space and the time. What does that mean? It means you are followed everywhere, in the air, on the land, no escape, no escape. I think I just give two more examples here. One is a Shanghai woman, a pregnant woman. Her water broke out earlier than expected. But according to the Shanghai policy, you must have a test done within the last 48 hours. Otherwise, you cannot be admitted into any hospital. So her husband drove her around and around after maybe 4 or 5 hospitals, she suffered a miscarriage on the road. And another thing, it's even more scary to me. It's, you know, we are talking about healthcare system, right? And this kind of code, well, it might be controversy if you use that, right? It still can be discussed. But in China, this kind of code system is used for politics. You know, for the Chinese government, the most important thing is social stability or political stability. So not too long ago, some banks in Henan province, they are facing bankruptcy. And the people in other provinces won't go to the banks to get their money back. But the funny thing is, the moment they step into Henan province and their code changed automatically to green. So it's used or abused, you know, the healthcare for political reasons. You know,
Désolée de vous interrompre. Le dernier mot.
Sorry, last word, then we come back to you, but you have to conclude, sir. Sorry. Thank you. Thank you for the perspective, which is a testimony as well, which question us about those answers to the. We'll come back to this, sir, but let's move on to Sylvie. You are the heart of this problematics of prevention for quite a while now. You've been there for quite a while, so good morning. I would like to thank the Cercle des Économistes for this very kind invitation to talk about a healthcare issue or health issue. I think the topic is to prevent future health shocks or impacts. It is important indeed to ask ourselves the question of how we can prevent some shocks. I don't believe that we could really fully prevent. There will be new pandemics, there will be new epidemics. Why? Because, in fact, before, in the past, epidemics were localized, but now with the transportation means and human mobility globally, you know, viruses propagate much faster. When humans move, viruses travel. When humans travel, viruses travel. As long as we will travel, there will be pandemics, epidemics, and there is nothing we can do about it. But ever, you know, man has always tried to travel faster and further, and this will not change in the future, sorry. But what we can try to do is to, even if we still face pandemics or epidemics, we want to make sure that they do not become shocks or crises as the one we experienced with the COVID. We've seen in the history there is a strong correlation between the advent of new transportation means and epidemics. Cholera, for example, cholera started spreading throughout the world in terms as a pandemic when steamships started navigating. The bacteria was able to cross the ocean, where in the past that was not possible. Well, it was not possible, and it was stopped by the duration of the transport. We must take this into consideration. The higher the improvements or the progress, the higher the risk of pandemics and epidemics. But I think we can prevent, it is possible to prevent the negative impact of such events by getting ready for it, by bracing for it. This was the disaster we witnessed with COVID. First, we were not ready. Many countries were actually not prepared at all to experience this type of events. Second, we are right in undergoing a technological revolution such that, in fact, our societies try to adapt themselves to these new technologies at the same time that they try to face a financial crisis. So in the future, if we want to prevent such shocks, not only do we need to get ready, but we must integrate within our preparation the new technologies which provide huge potentials. We can fight better against pandemics with the tools we have now versus what we had in the last century or before. But at the same time, we must use the tools properly. And the tools are often double-edged blades, so we must know how to use them. With three examples of tools or leads to better prevent future health or sanitary impacts. First, monitoring. Now we have the possibility to do genetic sequencing, so we can analyze the genomes of the viruses, and that's why we know there are several variants. We know that there won't be BA1, BA2, 3, 4, 5, that this data information that we would never had 10 years ago, in real time, that is. And this is key information, because then we are able to adapt vaccines, treatments as a function of viruses that circulate. The problem we face now, and this is what we will need to improve in the future, is that there is always a close link, a weak link between the scientific data and this knowledge of what is going on and the political decisions. We haven't found yet the link so that the data and information can be translated into healthcare policies that would be sufficiently nuanced and sufficiently agile to respond to the sanitary crisis. Second example is all the transformation in our information systems. I mean, we live in a new information ecosystem. Everybody's connected as far as smartphones. 58% of the global population is connected to the internet. So together with the social network, we are permanently exchanging information. So this is highly positive, of course, during epidemics, because we can inform everybody in real time and rapidly. The problem we've seen during this pandemics, the COVID, what we call the infodemia, that is basically an overload of information. That is, people don't know where to look and who to believe. And as we often said, too much information kills information. And basically, we don't know where to look, who to believe. And contradictory information increases anxiety and does not make it possible for people to make the proper decision for their own health, because they don't know who to believe. And we've seen during the epidemics and pandemics, we've seen the advent of, in addition to new variants, of new experts who have quite clear-cut opinions on the question, but which sometimes may make the communication process or about the measures somewhat blurry or confusing. So clearly we need to integrate this factor in our preparation, simply because infodemia had major impacts on the health of people, because people probably could have made decisions or adopted behaviors which were not in favor of their own health, helping them. But it did increase mistrust vis-à-vis institutions, mistrust vis-à-vis healthcare authority, mistrust vis-à-vis science. So this mistrust, this lack of confidence is something we're going to pay dearly for many years to come. We saw as well that this mistrust of rejection has increased the gaps in our society. They were pro-mask, anti-mask, pro-vaccine, anti-vaccine. So social separations or ruptures which pre-existed the pandemics got even more severe. And we talked about social link and the cohesion of our societies. Most important to take that into account when we get ready for the next pandemics. Third point, and I think I have to rush, the third point are all the technological innovations, vaccine and so on and so forth. And this is most important, and we all very happy about the improvements that make it possible to protect, because if we are to compare mortality rate during the pandemics of 1918, the Spanish flu and the pandemics, we saved more lives thanks to the treatment, the vaccines, and the progress achieved by medicine in 1 century. So it is most important. Such scientific improvements are very important, but at the same time, we can see that where we did not progress was basically on how research on acceptance of new measures, the way populations can better react to health crisis or sanitary crisis. So we need to reinforce research in social science on the impact of sanitary crisis on society and the economy to better anticipate the impacts and prevent them in the future. Thank you very much, Sylvie. Most interesting, we talk about prevention, but we want to have also the historic background. Sainda, we moving to you. This crisis was and it was also showed problems with mental health, and where we were all locked down. So how should the world get ready for the next crisis, for the next pandemics? How should we get ready for this?
Hey, bonjour tout le monde. It's very nice to be here. Thank you so much for this invitation. I hope you're all doing well. I think we have to think that this was a wake-up call, a very important wake-up call. And what we have to focus more is on a humanitarian response. I agree fully with Sylvia. We cannot prevent it, but we can maybe do quicker solutions than before. We are humans, we are evolving. It's the same thing with the mind. Every day the human mind evolves and changes. We're not okay, as we heard, until we are all okay. Until today, we are still not at the right point that it's not about who was wrong and where did it come from. It's about caring, and that's what we didn't do. We thought it was far, it's not going to come to us. We didn't do any quick response because we thought it's nothing to do with us. Let's go on with our life. But things happened differently. To prevent it, again, I say we cannot do that. However, there is so many points we can make this a quicker response. We hear a lot about fear, about panic, and fear and panic are the biggest weapons of all. You can, even when people had COVID, the fear and the panic is what made them become worse. And it's interesting that mental health has been talked about all these years. There's always that silver lining, right, in everything. At least now, again, we remind people, look how important it is. It took a whole pandemic for people to realize the importance of mental health. People need to work together. We need a crisis team that means, first of all, mental health, the government, politicians, educators, all of us need to work together. It's very important, and this is what we keep on seeing, that we are only okay when we do that. Creating leaders that are more resilient, that think, okay, this is not working, we can change it. It's okay if I was wrong. This is more important now than if I'm wrong or right. It's more about change, and making change, we always say, is better. These leaders need to be created from now. In schools, we need to educate about mental health. We saw how our education system went through such a trauma with our kids and how they went through all the stress. And we think now, as we know, humans are the quickest species to adapt, but there is PTSD that's happening to us. There are things that are going to evolve with time. Collecting data, collecting information. We have to keep on doing that, working on our public health, and always infusing mental health in all of these things. You are not okay if your mental health is not okay. We cannot pull out of things if we're not. When I hear people talk about COVID and what it's gone to, it doesn't matter if they're educators or politicians or work in the government, my head always goes to your health, your mental health state. How are you feeling? Is it stressing you? Is it fear? Can you not focus in what you can do? And having a well-being is something we need to focus, and all of us, I think, can agree that we have gone through some kind of trauma. We are still going through it. Even though now we are told that things are much better, you can go and come and travel, but the fear is still there, and we have to address it. We cannot sweep it under the carpet. We cannot do that. That is something we have to really acknowledge. We have to work on it. So when there is another pandemic or when something else happens, which it will happen, because we are humans, we travel, we move from here to there, we relate to each other, we talk to each other, it's going to happen, but we want quick response. We cannot prevent it completely, but we want something fast. We want something where, okay, now it's happening, let's create, where is that team, where is that crisis team, come in, what shall we do? Even when we heard about the Spanish flu, we only heard about it more, I'm talking about myself, now. It should be something that we needed to be educated about from before. This now, needs to be educated for years and years to come. It needs to be there. And the most important thing, again, is to think it's not just you. This pandemic has taught us that we are all in it together from all around the world. It doesn't matter if you're from the West, from the South, from Asia, from the Arab states. We are all in this crisis together. And the biggest thing is because it's unknown. And when humans are not sure about something and it's unknown, that creates mayhem, that creates chaos, that creates fear, that creates miscommunication. As we've heard, social media has given us so much fear, so much miscommunication, and people kept on listening to it and denying things that we needed to do. We needed to look after ourselves. The mask is important. Things are important. And up till today, of course, we have more than one person saying that I don't think it's important. It is not real. This was all imagination. So these are things that we need to educate ourselves with. And mental health is on the top of all of these topics that we'll be talking about every day in every conference.
Merci beaucoup, Sanida. Et enfin, on va passer à Philippe.
Thank you very much. Well, we'll come to Philippe now, and I'll come to the question that we've all asked ourselves, medical innovation. We've all become experts during this pandemic. Yes, experts in vaccines and variants. Well, I wanted to add to what Sylvie explained very clearly by way of introduction. Well, first element, after all, we are in Aix-en-Provence, so let me give you a few figures since this is an economic conference. We developed these new vaccines in over a 1-year period. This is unprecedented. It usually takes 10 to 12 years to develop a new drug. This is a technological feat. And it's been made possible by the good cooperation between industrialists, the industry, and the health authorities. Second element, before this wave of COVID, the world capacity for vaccine development was 4 billion doses. In a matter of months, we went up to a capacity of production of 24 billion doses. It's been multiplied 6-fold for one pathology. And some producers in India are stopping production of vaccines because we are in overproduction. So the issue is no longer a production issue, it's an issue of redistribution, of sharing of vaccine campaigns. This really, the real issue was never production. The first wave cost the health insurance in 2021 a bit less than 6 billion euros in France. A week of lockdown costs between 16 billion and 24 billion euros for the French economy. So I think the industry stepped up to the plate. I tend to say that, and Sylvie won't be cross at me, epidemiologists are very good at explaining how a disaster that they were incapable of predicting will not happen again. So, we are always very good the second time. But we have to constantly be in a position where we can imagine the unimaginable. It's a real challenge for health authorities, and there's a real threat. There are many threats, and we don't know which is going to translate into a world pandemic. Well, having said that, this can be nuanced, but I'll come back to this nuance in my conclusion. Let me focus on Europe and on France. First lesson learned is that everybody's realized what we've been saying for the last 10 years is that Europe is losing its strategic autonomy. We've become very dependent on the southeast of Asia for raw material, and we're dependent on the US for technological innovation. So there's a real challenge which is to make it possible for Europe and France to recover their health autonomy. I hate talking about sovereignty because I think it's a misnomer. What's at stake is to be able to reshore without deglobalizing. That's the first lesson we need to learn. Second lesson we can learn, what are the models that have proven to be successful? Well, the UK with the cooperation between Oxford and AstraZeneca, Germany with BioNTech. This single biotech generated 1.5% of GDP growth for Germany. This is food for thought, isn't it? Third example, Bioderma. Bioderma had never put a single drug on the market. So Pfizer, JSK, Sanofi are the main vaccine producers, but actually innovation went not in the direction of these major groups, but also innovation was made possible by biotechs. Is our model not too much in silos? Our research model, in which academic research and industrial research do not cooperate enough, we have a great network of biotechs, but they're too small and they're undercapitalized. Should we not give it some thought and get our ecosystem of R&D to really develop? And our health authorities have been very responsive in terms of authorizations, but France is a complex country. And we prided ourselves on having the greatest number of clinical trials, but we probably did it in a pretty scattered and not very strategized way. So I think there's also work to be done in that regard. And last point I wanted to make, the latest signs that were sent in terms of intellectual property were very counterproductive. With the new variants, I'm not sure that launching an attack against patents was the really best way to go. Everybody's looking at vaccines, everybody's looking at virus. So the next crisis will probably be resistance to antibiotics. We've known that problem for decades. We've consumed 4 generations of antibiotics in 1 generation of human beings. And research is at a stalemate. Why? Because the industry doesn't really invest a lot into antibiotics, because they know that if they find a new generation of antibiotics, there's no market for it. The health authorities will ban their marketization because they know that there's a problem of antibiotic resistance. So we need to find private partners, and this will be a major challenge for the years to come. Thank you very much for this, but your conclusion was a bit dark, a bit worrisome. But I don't know if we have questions in the audience. I have a few questions on my iPad, and then we'll give the floor to the audience. I'm sure you expected that. What should we think of monkeypox? And I'll add a question. Have we really learned anything if we're to be faced with a new emerging crisis? So maybe Sylvie first, and then we'll listen to all of you. Well, monkeypox is clearly an emergence that we've observed for decades, because we've first heard about it in the 70s in Asia and Africa. It had stayed in its niche, its environmental niche, as we call it. It is a zoonosis. And so first, of course, it was linked to traveling. It was travelers that actually caused the virus to appear, and then there were other factors that made transmission easy. We eradicated smallpox in 1978, so majority of the world population was immunized against pox viruses, same family of viruses, but from one generation to the next, we have fewer and fewer people who are immunized. So roughly speaking, people under 50 around the world are not familiar with that family of virus and are not immunized, which means that we have a pool, a potential pool of people that are at risk. So what we're striving to do at the moment is to mitigate the transmission of that virus, because for the time being, it spreads amongst young men that are pretty healthy. But what if it starts spreading amongst pregnant women, children? How will the virus behave? Pierre-Yves, you wanted to say something? Yes, I wanted to add food for thought. During that COVID-19 pandemic, we reminded everybody that one of the essential tools of public health in the face of emergence, when there are few cases, there's a strategy that can be very efficient, which is to screen widely enough to detect all new cases, isolate people so that they can't transmit it to others, and trace people that might have been in contact with these people. We know it works, but it works only when there are a limited number of cases so that they can be traced. Currently, we are completely incapable of tracing all people that have been in contact with COVID. We've all been in contact with COVID in this room, that's for sure. About monkeypox, we would be in capacity in this phase of the pandemic to trace. Is there tracing going on? No, none. It could have been done, it could still be done. It will probably not be done. So we could legitimately ask ourselves the question, have we learned anything? Not from what happened 50 years ago or 200 years ago, but what happened less than 2 years ago. We are making the same mistakes. So we haven't learned. Right, we'll take a question from one of the contact cases in the room, a gentleman with the blue T-shirt. Thank you very much. I have two questions. First, about the endogenous character. We talked about antibiotic resistance. We talked about several crises. They're often linked to human activities, transport, the melting of permafrost, zoonosis, areas of resistance. So what room for endogenization of these problems, and what thought is being given to prevention to avoid these, to prevent these diseases from emerging and creating a new shock? And my second question is, we'll have to be reconciled with a small number of actors that are going to have more and more sophisticated technology. So actually, the response will come from a limited number of players, of stakeholders, growingly limited. Philippe, did you want to tackle that idea of concentration? Yes. Well, just one word about your first comment. It is the question we asked about the monkeypox. Things are often more complicated than they might seem. I was in charge of prevention in a past career, and we set up the first campaign of respiratory virus. And we really conducted a number of studies on how to communicate, because we do not have the Chinese culture or the Japanese culture of face mask wearing, is that people would be convinced to put a face mask on to protect their children. If you can't leverage that, you lose your the main thrust in your communication. Second point I wanted to make, when we look at what happened with COVID and compare it to what happened with HIV/AIDS, 30 years ago. Well, 30 years ago, there was a quasi-monopoly. One company or two had the treatments. With the viruses, it was the opposite. There was a full globalization of research. There were Chinese vaccines, there were Russian vaccines, there were Indian vaccines, there were European vaccines, and it's really world research that developed. And the question you asked is very important. And I'll come back to patents. The main incentive, if we want to fight more efficiently pandemics to come, is competition. The first to come up with vaccines are incentivized through patents. So there's an intensification of competition, because 30 years ago you had 4 big pharmaceutical companies. Now there are 20. Nobody talked of Israel, Ireland, Singapore 30 years ago. So it's the opposite. It's actually more of a positive element. Thank you very much. We'll take another question in the room. Yes, hello. Thank you. I have a quick question about the role of digital technology in prevention. We've talked a lot about problem solving thanks to vaccines, but one of the main gains that we've seen in prevention has been made possible by digital technology. You haven't talked about this. I'm a bit surprised. Thanks to digital technology, we can have screening tools. Well, that's, a first level screening tool. So we're going to ask the same question to 1 million, 10 million patients. And it's a machine that can actually do that in an automated manner, and doesn't have to be a primary health practitioner. So how could we actually encourage Santé Publique France, the French health authorities, to take that step and use digital technology more? Because there is a reluctance. Well, it'd be interesting to hear also about digital technology for mental health, but we'll first listen to Sylvie. Well, when I talked about surveillance, it really requires a whole array of technologies. There is a deficit in the combination of these different technologies, and the health authorities that should be promoting all these digital technologies. So maybe it'll take a bit more time. What we try to do is encourage our member states to rethink their preparation plans for pandemics, factoring in digital technology in their preparedness plans, and diversify tools that they had before. The problem we currently have is that we keep trying to fight pandemics the way we did it in the 20th or 19th century. We haven't digitized our response to pandemics. And I think building on our experience with COVID, we should take that next step and work all together on this. Well, let me try and complement what Sylvie said. You saw that between the WHO and the pharmaceutical industry, there could be more of a strategic fit. I would complement with an economic perspective. We are faced with an emerging market, and we need to make it viable. In reality, in the pharmaceutical industry, when you associate a treatment with a digital part, payers cannot make that association viable. How can we assess these technological solutions of the future? We are moving from drugs to a holistic health solution that includes digital technology. So we have to really make the most of these digital technology tools. I'm talking about developed countries, probably not the same in developing countries. Well, just to pick up on what you said about this being the next challenge, who should rise up to the challenge? Does it have to be the states? Does it have to be the WHO? Who can shake things up? Well, WHO has a role to play. There are 194 member states that we advise. So when we issue technical guides, it is our responsibility to include these technical guides, the potential tools that they could use. But then it's up to each member state to include it in their strategy or not. It's up to each member state because it depends on the local context. But I am optimistic with regards to these new digital technologies. countries. I think telemedicine will be a great plus in terms of access to healthcare. We've seen that there were technological leaps. A lot of developing countries use their smartphones, never use landline. They, to develop telecommunications, some countries have actually once gone straight to mobile phones and never used landline when they didn't have telephone before. But to that end, we need to operate a paradigm shift. When we talk about primary health care, and it reminds me of Alma Ata, 1978, seems a bit obsolete, doing it on a shoestring to take care for people. I think primary healthcare in the 21st century has to be modern. We need to bring healthcare and services to the patients, even if they're in remote areas. This is how we will really make decisive gains. Is there time for a couple of questions, maybe? Thank you. Jean-Jacques Lambroso, I'm a journalist here and also in Africa. Well, in Africa, indeed, madam, they have all the systems on their mobile phones to pay at the till, to get money transferred to them, and they've used their mobile phones to do that for years. I wanted to say that I'm surprised, and I've been surprised over the last 3 days, to see that there's so very few people who came to this panel discussion. It's just a comment I wanted to make, because I'm surprised if people didn't come in larger numbers. Question for Mr. Lamoureux. How could we explain the current image that pharmaceutical companies have? You talked of the risk of too much lawmaking because it might hinder research. If we look at the share of public financing that has here in France or in the US that has gone to pharmaceutical companies, how do you explain that they have such a bad corporate image, bad public image? When there's been so much investment in these pharmaceutical companies, and there's also the matter of generating profit on the stock markets. Well, comment off microphone. What I'm saying, sir, is that we've conducted studies on the public image of pharmaceutical companies, and there's been a really significant impact on that sector linked to COVID-19 pandemic, because the fact that we responded so fast to this pandemic has completely changed our public image. You know, a number of economic sectors have a bad public image, but something changed there. And second element, when you look at the studies on public image, there's a disconnect, a pretty strong disconnect between the image of products that is fairly positive and the public image of companies that is not so good. And we know why. We're talking about the private sector. We're talking about a very important common good, which is health. And there are profit margins that are real, not everywhere, not for on all model, but it is profit that is going to drive innovation, that is going to incentivize innovation. And focusing on France, since your question is about France, 12 years ago, drugs represented 14%, and now it's 11%, which means that there's been very little growth. If we look at all the new technological advances, new cancer treatments, we've had to really make room to make for more innovation, and we have actually both products that are out of stock and longer lead times. We've decapitalized the pharmaceutical sector by 6 billion over 12 years. I apologize, we'll have to wrap up. I would have loved taking more questions. I had more questions, but we've been fortunate enough to have really very interesting insights. We unfortunately didn't have time to come back on China, which is a lot of food for thought when we talk about preventing a next pandemic. But please feel free to go to our speakers if you want to find out more. And many thanks to our panelists.
Good morning still. We're here to rebuild multilateralism. 1 hour to do so. And we're going to do it being faithful to the method applied, announced by Jean-Hervé Lorenzi at the beginning of the rencontre. That is 2 days. On Sunday will be the last day of the rencontre. And we're here to propose solutions. We are not here to establish diagnostic. That was done in all the round tables until now. We're here to propose solutions, concrete solutions to rebuild multilateralism. But this is highly complicated. And why is it complicated? Because in a way, the world never been in such a need for common joint solution for common goods, and it's never been so difficult to produce them. So we need coordination on traditional international coordination topics such as macroeconomic stability, financial stability, food security, the price of raw materials. That was always the role of multilateral institutions, development funding of development. And of course, we have a whole series of new topics that crop up that reinforces the problem and the difficulty, and which in the domain of food safety, energy security, the consequence of the current crisis and the war in Ukraine. In the domain of global value chain, we have to repair the value chain which have been damaged, complicated first by the COVID crisis, then by the Ukraine crisis. And again, I'm not establishing a diagnostic. That was done in the previous sessions. But, well, current multilateral institutions in their current form are not suited to answer such questions. If we take the global chain of value chain, is it who should deal with it? The World Bank or the World Trade Organization? Who should do it? How should it be done? So there are topics which grow rapidly, which are new around technology, regulation of major digital platforms. So this is what I'm doing, by the way, in my job, on my daily job as in the authority to control competition. We need international cooperation, cyber resilience, coordination and exchange between when it comes to personal data protection. So we have bilateral agreements, but not multilateral agreements. And I could give you an endless list. So huge needs and solutions which not only are not here for the new topics, but are more and more difficult for the traditional topics. Why? Because the world is fragmented politically, will be also fragmented economically, even though all the economists do not agree, but at least for the production of goods, which global chain, value chain, which are highly disturbed, maybe not so much for the services. Political fragmentation, there is a fracture in the multilateral system, which is the rivalry between the US and China. I'm sure we will discuss it in our roundtable here. And today, there is war in Ukraine, which creates new fractures, and where the Westerners are, they think they're on the right side. We're on the right side, a good side, but emerging countries, developing countries, do not always agree with you, do not vote with us on our side in the United Nations, and do not want to compromise their relationship with Russia. So we need a view which is not that of the West necessarily. All this is difficult, and I think, as we hear in Aix-en-Provence, and because of the composition of this panel, I think it is essential that we should spend time on the possible contribution to the new world, required world order of two regions, that is Europe and the Eurozone, but more specifically Europe and the United Kingdom, which, regardless of what they think, is still part of Europe, well, at least geographically speaking, and I hope from a viewpoint of value and civilization, and China, which is also represented here. So, to talk all this, we do have a remarkable panel. First, there will be Yanis Tournaras, the governor of the Greek Central Bank, who can bear witness of the European construction work, but also the difficulty of this work. And we'll hear Yanis talk about that. We'll hear Henry Wang, who presides the Center for China and Globalization, and who is the advisor to the Chinese government on those points. Nare Woods, who is the dean of the governance school of Oxford University, online with us, on screen, and thank you for being with us. Marie Pangestu, who is General Director at the World Bank, and who will share her vision of a multilateral institution that is the World Bank. And especially at a time when G20 is presided by Indonesia, and Mary, who was a minister in Indonesia, will be able to share with us a vision of the role of G20 in this process. So I have the floor to Yanis. Please less than 10 minutes each in your talk so that we can have a dialogue with the room and with the audience on the internet.
Thank you, Benoit. It is a great pleasure to be with you today. I talk about economic fragmentation mostly, rather than political. And I would start with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has brought the European Union and the Western developed economies as a whole in front of the greatest challenge since the end of the Cold War. So globalization is reversing. The result is a slowdown in the European, the global economy, and rising prices and interest rates. Stagflation winds are blowing everywhere, particularly in Europe, which is a large net energy importer. The world around us has changed a lot. Concerns over supply chain security, energy security, and diversification have become dominant, increasing the need for a regional counterweight. This is the familiar theme of open strategic autonomy. Up to now, reform through crisis undermines Europe's role on the international scene, weakens social cohesion, fueling anti-European sentiment. I'm not sure we can afford, either financially, socially, or politically, to keep relying on the same crisis-reacting propulsion mechanism. A multipolar and partially deglobalized world order is one where Europe needs to act proactively, not retroactively. Despite considerable progress during the great financial crisis, there are several areas of financial integration in Europe where reforms have stalled. The Eurogroup has neither been able to agree on the establishment of a European deposit insurance scheme, nor to reform both banking crisis management and bank resolution processes. The reason that Eurozone member states have not agreed on completing banking union has mainly to do with disagreement on whether risk reduction measures or risk-sharing ones should be taken first. Incidentally, why not taking measures simultaneously, perhaps allowing a specific time horizon? That seems to be a win-win solution. On financial initiatives, the time has come to revise the fiscal framework enshrined in the Stability and Growth Pact. Our aim should be to ensure member states' debt sustainability, to achieve counter-cyclicality of fiscal policy, and to create a central fiscal capacity of all Eurozone member states. Many, including Germany's current Chancellor, have described the Next Generation EU Fund as Europe's Hamiltonian moment. But this is still built as a temporary crisis response. It needs to be transformed into a permanent mechanism combining fiscal centralization with appropriate rules to avoid moral hazard. The Eurozone is a complete monetary union, but it is still an incomplete fiscal, banking, and capital markets union. This, in times of crisis and uncertainty, like the present ones, due to the Russian invasion and the war in Ukraine, produces financial fragmentation and, among others, prohibits the efficient transmission impulses of monetary policy in all euro area jurisdictions. Hence, now is the time to act. We must be proactive, not retroactive. Turning to ancient Greek mythology, we should act as Prometheus did, and not as his brother Epimetheus. But let me first acknowledge the significant progress that has been achieved in the EU economic governance framework since the eruption of the great financial crisis. We have proceeded with the Reform and Stability and Growth Pact between 2011 and 2013 with the objective to enhance fiscal and macroeconomic surveillance and coordination. We have the creation of the Banking Union, SSM in 2014, SRM in 2016 with the objective to mitigate contagion effects. We have the creation of the EFSF in 2010 and its successor, the ESM in 2012, a tool for the prevention and management of sovereign debt crisis. Finally, we had very recently the amendment of the ESM Treaty in 2021 so that the ESM can provide a backstop to the Single Resolution Fund and quell future crises before they escalate. But the momentum seems to have run out of steam before ambitious reforms have been completed, e.g. Banking Union and the European Deposit Insurance Scheme, or reforms are already outdated and need a major overhaul, a Stability and Growth Pact. Well, I will start with very quickly how to improve our economic governance. Many people have provided many ideas. 2 minutes? Okay, so I will go very, very quickly. Greece has an experience since the crisis in 2010, so I will go very, very quickly. I will have a complete text later if you want. We need a new Stability and Growth Pact, which, first of all, makes sure that debt sustainability remains a national responsibility, but there is counter-cyclicality, and there is also a permanent and not a temporary fiscal instrument at the center of Europe, like the NGEU, but with rules which avoid moral hazard. We should make sure that we give incentives to governments to have buffers to stabilize outputs in cases of recession. Second, we need to complete the banking union. Mostly here, we need to establish a European deposit insurance scheme, but also to revise the banking crisis management like the resolution processes. I stop here to give time, but we can discuss things later. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup Yanis. On pourra revenir sur plusieurs de ces questions lors de la discussion.
Henry.
Thank you for having this opportunity to speak at this great forum. I think the topic is very interesting, very relevant today. It is building multilateralism. I mean, we are in France, so we are actually having participants around the world for this great forum. And I'm the only person flying from China to attend this forum, so I'm very pleased to be here. Yes. I think that this is really a time we discuss about multilateralism. We know that globalization is now at a crossroad. It's really at a very risky, probably in the history of mankind. It's 77 years plus the Bretton Woods system established. We had the World Bank, we had the IMF, WTO, and all those great institutions. Now it's all really needs to be repaired and needs to be upgraded and enhanced. And but we see the world is actually getting more and more dangerous now. For example, we see there's a lot of military conflict, the war in Ukraine, and also the world is really in chaos, plus the pandemic. But one of the things I think we have to pay attention is that how we can really push the world in the right direction. Are we really having all those more military alliance and secure alliance that are going to help for? For example, we see the NATO expansion. We see also Russian against Ukraine. We see, of course, Five Eyes now wants to get Korea to be part of it, and we see AUKUS being built in the Pacific region. And we see Quad, of course, also a mini NATO probably established in the Pacific, Indo-Pacific region. And also we see IPAF. So all the things actually, I think it's really not helpful. I mean, that's not really the right direction. We should really build on the pillars of the Bretton Woods system that enhance the economy and globalization. So I'm coming from China, but I see that China is really, for the last number of years, concentrated on the economic globalization. For example, China started the Belt and Road Initiative. It's really signed with 20 countries and another 40, 50 international organizations on building the Belt and Road. China has joined RCEP, the largest economic free trade agreement in the world now. And then China is applying to join CPTPP, another free trade upgradation of also in the region. China is applying to join DEPA, a digital arrangement. China have signed a great investment treaty with EU, CAI, comprehensive agreement on investment. Of course, that has been put on hold due to the sanctions of each other. But also, China has signed a great agreement with African on this China-African Cooperation Forum, hold it every 2 years. So you see, China is basically expanding and trying to help on the international occasion. So we would like to see more of that. But of course, we see how we can really push forward is the, we are facing the real dangerous world now. We have climate change. China has joined the Paris Accord, and China has actually worked agreement with US on the Paris climate change at the COP26. And of course, also, we know that there's many things we need to have the world work together. Not only, there's security, but let's have more economic, prosperity and focus more on the economic reconstruction. So there's several things that I can propose to work together, between China and other great countries in the world. First, we could do is that in addition to the climate change, we could work together on the infrastructure, because the infrastructure is the biggest common denominator of every country. EU has proposed 300 billion on the infrastructure, EU Global Gateway. And US, President Trump has proposed 1.2 trillion on the infrastructure. And also Build Back Better, B3W. So China has this Belt and Road. I mean, why can't we Belt and Road, B3W, and all those things work together, and EU Global Gateway? Let's focus on infrastructure. I was talking to Larry Summers. We had a 1-hour dialogue just about 3 months ago. And he was saying, Henry, maybe we could work, World Bank should replenish and, work more on the infrastructure and green development. I would say that is a really great idea. I love to see that. China has launched the AIB, Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. Asia Infrastructure, AIB actually is joined by UK, EU, almost all the European countries. And it's a global bank. So why not the World Bank, AIB, ADB, AFDB, European Development Bank, let's all work together for the infrastructure needs. Let's even have a new Marshall Plan for the post-Ukraine construction. So this is really something we have to work together. And on top of that, I think we could also work on we have the geopolitical very dangerous now. We should work, China, EU, and the US should really work together. So why can't we have a G3 summit? That's a G3 summit. Talk about those global burning issues, dangerous issues. Let's all three parties talk. And, and the EU can mediate the China-US tensions. So there's many things we could do. So this G3 summit, I think it's not only G2, but let's say it's G3. So it's really, really good. And finally, on this Ukraine issue, I wrote a piece at the New York Times on how China can help on that. I think we should really pursue the international mediation. Why not let UN play more role? I mean, P5, permanent 5 member countries, plus EU, plus Ukraine. Let's have a 7-party talks. Let's all sit down, and China could be at the table, and really, we have to find a solution there. Let's have a ceasefire. Let's have a really a more secured, more balanced peace structure for Europe and for Ukraine and Russia. So I think there's many things can be done. But I just want to conclude saying that this is really a great conference that we can really talk about those issues. multilateralism is really the danger now, but we have regional things going on. So I'm glad to see WTO Minister, MC12 meeting just held last month has reached some really objective. Fishery agreement has been signed, has been achieved after almost 20 years of negotiations. Also, China-US work out on this patent of a vaccine waiver for the developing countries. And also plastic emission, anti-plastic emission into the ocean has also been agreed. So there's many things, if we really determine, if we really can sit down and work together, we can really realize, the objective. We have to really work on that. Thank you.
Merci, Henry.
Thank you for your very constructive vision and concrete vision, which is exactly what is needed today. Mary. Bonjour, morning. It is a great pleasure to be here in Aix-en-Provence. Thank you, Benoit. Thank you to the organizers. I will propose 3 hypotheses about concerning international institutions which have to be challenged if we need to find solutions. For the English speakers, I will switch to English soon, says Madame. First, divisions in the world, rivalry between China and the US and the US have rendered international institutions less useful? No, true. Second hypothesis. The hypothesis that leadership, the internal management of international institutions has no importance on their success. I'll discuss that again. Third, the hypothesis that in a fragmented world, it is better to rely on small coalitions, small groups, coalition groups of volunteers, coalitions of the willings to continue cooperation, and I will demonstrate that this is highly dangerous. No, I switch to English, says Madame.
So the first point I want to make is about the idea that international institutions and cooperation are less useful in a world of the geostrategic rivalry, which I think is profoundly wrong and ahistoric. I want to just make 3 quick points on this. So the first is that the crises the first is we need to refocus international institutions on the issues that absolutely need international cooperation, that no country can take forward progress without cooperation. And that means narrowing the agenda. Food, energy, debt would be the highest on my agenda, because we cannot resolve those problems without international institution. Happily, and here we point towards solutions, the world, even the divided world, is managing to find solutions on these things. Small baby steps. The debt suspension initiative that the G20 remitted to the IMF. The recent trade agreement that was achieved in the WTO last week. These are examples. I think we now need to be more creative. At the very height of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union concluded a treaty on the neutrality of Vienna. That was in 1951. Let's remember that. Perhaps that's a model for how we deal with Taiwan over the next decade to avoid conflict. So my first point is we need international institutions even more at this point. The second is the world and member states pretty much ignore the quality of leadership and performance within international institutions. They fight like crazy to have their own national become the head, and then they pretty much look the other way during the tenure, and very rarely do they collectively assess that performance. And yet history shows us how important the quality of leadership is. There are 3 things we should expect the leader of an international organization to do, that we should measure their performance on. The first is, can they really broker agreement among member states as Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala did last week in the World Trade Organization, but many others failed to do? Second, do they persuade governments to give the organization resources? Look at what Robert McNamara did when he was president of the World Bank as an extraordinary example, quadrupling the resources of the institution. And the third is, do they attract, develop, and retain the best talent in their organization? Or do they simply give up in the face of political pressures from their members? And again, some extraordinary examples. A final example I would throw to you is Dag Hammarskjöld, when he was Secretary General of the United Nations, and invented, using his power as Secretary General, the whole notion of peacekeeping for the United Nations. So it's to say, let's not ignore the leadership of these organizations. They will be a crucial part of these solutions that Benoit asked us to look for. My third point is about coalitions of the willing. In a world where cooperation is difficult, it's very tempting to say, let's just gather together the willing. Look at what the United States and Europe and the United Kingdom did on sanctions against Ukraine. They blasted ahead, hoping others would follow. And in April of this year, they found 82 members of the United Nations refusing to follow. We've got to take that seriously and ask, what is it that those countries are afraid of? Because every single one of them wants to uphold the sovereignty of Ukraine. So what is it that they are afraid of? Quick observation. What they're afraid of is the difference between the G7, the G3 that Henry mentioned, the G20, or a coalition of the willing, setting an agenda or signaling the importance of an issue. That's fine. The G7, the G20 have done that seriously. The differences between that and those small groups of countries actually setting binding rules which they expect all other countries to agree with, even when they have never taken into account the effect on other countries. And here I would give, as a controversial example, the OECD tax agreement, which went ahead with zero research into how that agreement would affect small countries and emerging economies who now will find their chances to attract investment, according to them, hampered by this agreement. So consultation is vital. I would finish with the words of Robert McNamara in his book, In Retrospect. He was the architect of America's war in Vietnam, disastrous war. One of his main lessons was this: the United States should always consult its allies, not for them, but for itself, because only by consulting other countries do you really test your own understanding of your national interests and how best to pursue them. Thank you.
Merci. Merci, merci.
Thank you very much. And thank you for debunking this idea that coalitions of the willing should replace or be in competition with international organizations. Well, we'll now listen to Mary Pengastu. She's the only representative of the World Bank and of an international organization today. Over to you, Mary.
Thank you, Benoit. I hope you can all hear me. I'm here in Bali. I regret not being able to join you in person. I'm here after attending the G20 foreign ministers meeting, where one of the topics indeed that was discussed was the importance of multilateralism in facing this multiple crisis that we are all facing: the COVID-19, the climate, and of course the war in Ukraine and all its implications. And I just wanted to agree with Ngairi that in this kind of situation, international institutions become even more important. Bueno, you asked me a perspective on G20. You know, whatever you say about G20, we should not necessarily measure the success of G20 with concrete deliverables. In some respects, there have been some concrete deliverables in the past, and in this year of Indonesia, there has been some progress on, say, pandemic preparedness, for instance. But what is more important, I think, with forums such as G20 is to actually, in today's very fragmented world, it's still a forum where you can still engage. The G20 Foreign Affairs Ministers meeting actually had, for the first time, almost all of the G20 ministers, including China, the US, and Russia. You could say that at least they are in the same room. There are opportunities to engage, and there are opportunities to share their views. Whether or not there were results or concrete deliverables is still something that is maybe not yet obvious. But there was a lot of discussion on, for instance, how to unblock the passage for food out of Ukraine, as well as making sure fertilizers and food will continue to come out of Russia and Belarus. No conclusions yet, but as I said, I think engaging is already perhaps something that we could see as positive. And you could say that there was a sense of urgency in this discussion as well as many other discussions. How do we coordinate internationally to face these really global challenges? I think the current situation, as all of you have mentioned, is really putting a question on the future of multilateralism and globalization. But it also offers an opportunity for all of us to ask fundamental questions on how can we have more collective action, how do we strengthen and build on existing international organizations and mechanisms, and do we need to create new partnerships, new coalitions? I think this is really the fundamental question. Let me just share from a World Bank perspective the response that's been happening since the pandemic. And it's important to recognize that, at least from our perspective, there has been meaningful global cooperation through the COVID-19 pandemic, where we have been able to undertake surge financing to help low-income countries to save lives, livelihoods, and amounting to, since the start of the pandemic, we have committed to and disbursed $270 billion of support. And it's not just financing, obviously, but the how to, what are the priority issues that need to be done in each country, whether it's the vaccination, whether it's the health systems, and whether it's the social protection systems, and so on. And this would not have been possible without the extraordinary replenishment of IDA, which is the International Development Assistance funding we have, which provides grants and concessional funding to the poorest countries to really help public health issues, socioeconomic impacts from the pandemic, and so on. And this, I think, is a real demonstration of solidarity by higher income countries, including France. And it's also allowing us to do surge financing for the next 15 months of 170 billion to address the continued needs to save lives and livelihoods, such as the food security issue that has already been mentioned. Out of that 170 billion, 30 billion is going to be allocated to food security. So that's kind of the multilateral response for ensuring that developing countries, especially the poorest, can be supported during these very tough times. But indeed, we need to do more, and it's not just about financing. It's what needs to be done. We see some countries and the international mechanisms that we are seeing now underperform in coordinating the crisis response and in tackling the externalities of global public goods, whether it's pandemic, whether it's food security and financial stability, whether it's climate, or making sure that we have a continued open trading system. So some examples that we see are uncooperative trade policies, like during the COVID-19 pandemic, with advanced purchases and export controls on medical goods, which really increase the trade costs almost by 60%. So these kind of policies lead to unequal distribution of vaccines, as well as leading to several waves of the pandemic taking place because of the uneven distribution and increased costs. And we are seeing a lot of increase in protectionism, nearshoring and friendshoring as a response to the logistic bottlenecks, even though in the past shocks like the Japan earthquake showed that they are not economically efficient as diversifying sources of inputs. And in the trade policy restrictions that we see in the food crisis, this is also really actually accentuating the increase in the food prices. And this is exactly what happened in 2008, where about 50% of the food price increase was due to these restrictions. And we estimate that at the moment, these restrictions are also responsible for the 9% increase out of the 20% increase in the world wheat prices. Weak coordination on the debt issue, weak coordination between Paris Club, non-Paris Club and private creditors has increased the risk of the debt crisis, and countries' slow response to climate change over the past decade has also contributed to climate-related shocks. Why should we be concerned, especially from a developing country perspective? Management of global public goods has become critical to avoid development reversals. Multilateralism has contributed to increased trade, growth, poverty reduction, and better managing global public goods. So without multilateralism, I think developing countries will be the one most hurt. Investment is needed to address the climate change crisis. And this will require an unprecedented level of international cooperation and financing. So I'd like to agree with the point Mr. Wang made it earlier about the importance of increasing investments in sustainable infrastructure as addressing both climate and development. Third, why we should be worried is that crises in a more interconnected world are becoming more global than before. COVID-19 really was the largest simultaneous shock across countries since the 1930s. And the crises are interrelated. You know, COVID is not unrelated to the climate, and the food insecurity is you know, something that existed even before the war. The war accentuated it, but climate is one of the drivers for insecurity and so on. And finally, why should we be worried? We predict that crisis will increase in frequency and shocks will increase in frequency due to climate change. And there could be other shocks, whether it's health, whether it's finance, whether it's economic, or whether it's social. So really, this recurring and frequency of crisis, we really need to strengthen multilateralism and will require greater coordination at the international level. And it starts with existing multilateral organizations. It is really international organizations, strengthening them are needed for us to be successful in achieving multilateralism. Unilateral and bilateral solutions or regional solutions will not be the answer for us to achieve multilateralism. I mean, I can go into detail on this on the trade side, but let me just, because of time, just finish on a few other ideas that we need to do to really use the opportunity of these recurring crises and how to do a better job of responding. The second issue would be establishing rules and procedures at the international level to help countries better account for positive and negative externalities when responding to shocks and making their policy responses more impactful. I think we should learn from the pandemic about how we should be responding in the next pandemic, not just for the prevention and the preparedness, but what do you do with the vaccine distribution and so on and so forth. We need to take measures to help countries internalize externalities of public goods, for instance, in the area of climate change, introduce carbon pricing and develop carbon standards, and really make sure developing countries have the capacity to meet these standards. Better equip MDBs to respond to more frequent crises, and the increased importance of global public goods, including through innovative solutions to further increase financing. And finally, I just wanted to make a point about regional mechanisms. I think coalition of the willing, if it is really a closed block, if you like to use that word, and exclusive and not considering other groups or especially developing countries, are not very productive. But regional mechanisms that are building blocks, whether in the trade sense or whether, for instance, some of the regional responses to the pandemic or even regional efforts for energy security, these can be also contributing to multilateralism. So let me stop there and thank you very much for providing the opportunity for me to share some of my thoughts.
Merci, Marie.
Thank you very much, Marie. Thank you all. Well, we have great luxury, which is that we'll be able to have a debate. I'll ask panelists if they want to add something or comment on what other panelists said. Then I'll have a few questions, and then I'll encourage the audience to ask questions. But maybe first I give you the floor to the panelists. Would you like to add anything or comment or pick up on anything that might have surprised them or shocked them in what others said?
Je vois que tu as envie d'intervenir.
Well, no, I was going to ask Henry. The world needs infrastructure funding. But why do we need international cooperation to get infrastructure funding? I can understand that it would be good to have international cooperation, but I could say, well, infrastructure funding is actually in the basket of things that individual countries or, for example, the European Union could do. And in a world where cooperation is so desperately needed on other issues, should we be doing international cooperation on infrastructure or not?
Thank you, Nadja. I think probably we do, because given the example China has on the AIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, has been very, very successful. We have China as a president, UK is a vice president, the largest recipient is India. And so this is really great, and also AIB has stopped its project in Russian and so I think there's a lot of things that we can work together, because I see now the developing countries are really not benefiting from the what China, US, or probably EU are doing all on its separate. So World Bank is really a good example. But World Bank was dealing the problem in the past much more less complicated and small scale. But I think the world has getting into a stage that where we need the whole, we need to set up a world infrastructure investment bank if World Bank is not performing that. So I think we can strengthen the World Bank, which is a Bretton Woods system product and has been functioning well, and so that we can at least experiment a portion of that development bank alliance for African, for Latin American, for many other countries. Also, let's have international competitive bidding, public procurement, transparency, loans, and avoid the debt trap, so that we can really experiment out a public mechanism that is applicable to third countries. So countries like China, US, EU, UK really can work together, because talk about infrastructure, China has now the best experience in the world now because of the infrastructure success they had. So I think it's really needed. In addition to the climate change too, we have to tackle the infrastructure for the green development. We have to do that as well. So I think there's many things we can work together on this global infrastructure common challenge, which I think is really the biggest deficit that probably we're facing now in many, many countries.
Merci, Henry.
Thank you. I wanted to ask our panelists about one word that Marie used, and Christine Lagarde also used it. That word, friend-shoring. The idea The idea that value chains might be more resilient if we produced in countries that are also allies. For an economist, it is a bit disturbing because how are we to manufacture iPhones if we are to build all the components in allied countries and close geographically? Many countries have become dependent on Russia for energy because Russia was supposed to be an ally, a friend. So actually the energy crisis in Europe, you might argue, is the result of that friendshoring because your allies of yesterday or of today are not necessarily your allies or your friends tomorrow. So what do you think about this concept?
It's an interesting concept because if you think of it from the European Union or from the United States or from China, it looks like a way of assuring your national security. But I want to look at it from what it means for all the other countries in the world. You know, I'm originally from New Zealand. I know what it's like being from a small country. Because there, it can look more like a new form of empire, right? Where you're required to choose which block you're going to supply, and once you've made that choice, everything follows. And you very quickly find yourself beholden just to the one block. And actually, for most other countries in the world, they want to be able to choose, and they need to be able to choose in order that they get the best deal, even with their most friendly bloc. So that would be my concern.
Yanis?
Yes, well, I'm a strong believer of in free trade. So friendshoring is a necessity if you face constraints, but it's a second best solution. I mean, the first best solution is to have free trade among everybody, among every partner. And in my view, in the case of energy, Europe has no alternative now. If there is an embargo, for instance, on natural gas, but finding alternatives among friends. But the solution is, I said, second best. I mean, the first best is to find a new, let's say, a new platform for negotiating a solution to the problems we face today. I can say that what I've heard from Henry was a pleasant surprise, so I'd like to ask Henry how China can contribute and can alleviate the fears of the West regarding its participation in world trade. Thank you.
Okay, thank you both, Brenda and Yanni. Yeah, no, I think that we are living in the 21st century. It's already we are not living in the Cold War era. So the world is too much intertwined already. So I think this friendshoring, first to answer that, it's really not against the principle of free trade. You know, David Ricardo, this competitive advantage, we should really stick to it because I see China has a lot. 95% of iPhone are made in China, but that can be worked on the 724 basis. So can that be really replicated elsewhere? That's I mean, big question, because China has, for example, out of the 7 largest container ports, 7 of them in China. China, anywhere you go, is about 5-6 hours by speed train. Have a 1 billion smartphone user, and China is the largest trading nation with 130 countries. China every year provides 12 million college graduates, abundant talent pool there. So China is really great on the 1 to 100, But US, EU may be good on a 0 to 1. But let's do it. If US and EU good at innovation, might as well continue to do that. And if China is good at production, delivery, and value chain, upstream, downstream, and cohesiveness to do that, and China has no strikes also, by the way, and is very productive, very efficient. So let's maybe, watch on. So if we can all get benefit of that. And also this trade war going on, the tariff, has driven up, according to some think tank, 2% of US inflation because they are putting tariff on goods from China. So last year, when the world is having all this pandemic, China's import-export to the world has gone up almost 30%, historical high. So I think China is stabilized the economy of the world. China is the really great beneficiary, provider of the world. So I think, if the thing's going well, why should we really disrupt that? I don't really see the reason for that.
Benoit, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
Because a big theme of all of yesterday's rencontre was for European governments, what do they do in the face of having spent so much money during COVID? And now, do they reduce the state, which we heard French politicians arguing for reducing the state, we heard others arguing for increasing expenditure, and our central banker from Greece has put on the table a counter-cyclical stability and growth pact. So you're a central banker. Do you agree with the governor of Greece? Should there be a counter-cyclical growth and stability pact? And how will we know when politicians are being counter-cyclical and when they're simply buying themselves a new election?
Bon, on aurait sans doute besoin de 2 heures de plus pour parler de ces sujets.
Well, it would probably take hours to answer that. I quite often agree with Yanis, so I'm not going to contradict him today. But I think that the priority for European governments, whatever they be today, is to convert support to demand, to support into support to investment. There's been a lot of support during COVID that was necessary and led to the constitution of huge savings that are not used today. A big chunk of that money was saved by households. So the issue is to now downsize, gradually support mechanisms, because interest rates will no longer make it possible to increase the debt the way it was possible over the last few years, but especially to change this, the configuration of that support, bring support to those who really need it, the most vulnerable households, and convert all that excess in savings into investment so as to meet all the objectives that we've discussed, investment for climate change being one of them. So it's more the composition of that support than its intensity. That's my 30-second answer. Yanis, and then we'll wrap up because I can see a lot of stop signs coming up because we have to vacate the room. So, Yanis, last words.
Time in my introduction, you know, in Greece, in the beginning, we took the strictest measures. We had the biggest reduction of the primary deficit in the OECD. We turned it into a primary surplus. But at the end of the programs, the public debt to GDP ratio was higher than the beginning. Why? Because the snowball effect, which is the difference between the growth rate and the interest rate, was negative and countervailed the primary effort. This is what we want to avoid in the new Stability and Growth Pact. It should not be procyclical. And there are ways.
Merci à tous et merci d'avoir proposé des solutions.
Thank you very much, and thank you for actually coming up with solutions, because we really need them today. That's what we need the most. Thank you all.